Hello, I'm just going to record a super quick tutorial on how to use multi-UV tiles in a texturing workflow. Benefits of using multiple UV tiles are that most 3D applications will support them if you're texturing in a 3D application, but also if you're texturing in something like Photoshop, using multiple tiles is a way to avoid having to need to apply multiple materials to one mesh, because if you apply multiple materials on either a face-by-face basis or an object basis, it can sometimes cause massive problems at render time. So by using multiple UV tiles, you don't need to worry about cramping everything down onto one tile, and you have more freedom to get higher resolution textures, essentially. So I have this mesh, this building mesh, and if we look at the UV texture editor, you can see that it occupies 2 tiles. And when you open Maya by default, you'll only have this tile shaded in. To get it so that it supports multiple tiles, you need to go to Image Range on the checkbox, and then change the maximum U and maximum V to the number of tiles that you're using. So it'll be a default 1 by 1. So if I just apply that, you can see it only supports this tile. And because I'm using 2 tiles, I want it to be U2, V1. There we go. But how would you know what numbers to set this to? In order to work that out, you have to know how UV tiles work. So if I just switch over into Photoshop, you can see I've got this set up here. So if we imagine that, let's just switch to a color, it's more easy to see. So if we imagine that this is my first tile, tile 1, this is tile 2, this is tile 3, and this is tile 4, how do you know what the coordinates are for these? Well, it's really simple. So if this is your origin here, it's very similar to X and Y, only U and V. And U goes along on this axis, that's U, and then this axis up here is V. So this point in the middle, at the very bottom, is U0, V0. This point here, because it's along U, is U1, V0, U2, V0, and now we start going up, so that then becomes U2, V1, because we're 2 along, 1 up. This in the middle is U1, V1, and by default this tile, this point in here, will be the edge of your Maya boundary. That tile in there will be this corner up here. And then this one would be U0, V1, and this up here is U0, V2, and U1, V2, and this one U2, V2. So essentially the coordinates U2, V2 allow for up to 4 tiles, and you can have as many tiles as you like. You can just go on forever. But for these purposes, the tiles that I'm using for the building are these 2 here. So that means that my image range would need to be set to U2, V0, or in Maya's case it would be V1. So let's just go back into Maya, and there you can see U2, V1 gives me this tile setup. Okay, so how would you texture something like this? Well, in order to get these tiles out of Maya and into something like Photoshop, which is what I'm texturing this building in, you just go Polygons, UV Snapshot, as you normally would, and 1048 should be fine for the resolution. But you have to change the Umax and the Vmax, and treat these 2 numbers as you did with the image range. So I want my Umax to be 2 because I want 2 tiles along, but I'm only going 1 tile up, so that needs to stay as 1. And then you press OK, and it would export. And then if you were to open that in Photoshop, you would have something that looks like this. Obviously I've already textured this one, but if I turn the textures off, this is what would happen if you put a black background behind it. You can see you've got 2 tiles, and I put these rulers down in Photoshop just to keep things organized so that I can see where one tile ends and the other tile begins, and it also becomes handy later when you export these tiles. If you were to texture in Mari and then export directly from Mari, it supports multiple tiles in that it would automatically name the tiles depending on their coordinates, but because we textured in Photoshop you can't do that. So if I just turn the diffuse back on and turn the guides off. So say these are my tiles done. If I wanted to export the tiles, you have to do it on a tile by tile basis. So what I do is I crop it down like that. Oh. Crop it down to the border, which is going to be 1096. 1096, so it's 2096 in this case, the tile's bigger. And then you would save it as, I'm going to call it building diff, because it's the diffuse channel, and I would call it U1 V1, and that's the same naming convention that Mari would use. It always starts at 1 instead of starting at 0, which is strange, but I'm going to keep things identical to Mari just so it's easier to use. Okay, JPEG, yep, and we'd save that one. And then you undo the crop and recrop it to select your next tile, and then you save that one as, it's quite straightforward, save it as building diff u2 v1 because it's the second tile along but still on the bottom row. And then you have your two tiles saved. I'm just going to undo that crop as well. Always make sure you undo the crop, otherwise you'll lose all of this when you save. So now we go back into Maya and start applying materials. Right click, assign new material. I'm just going to do it with a Lambert for now. And then go into your color, and the way multi-tile setups work in Maya is you can use a layered texture. So you find it down here at the bottom. And the layered texture works in that each one of these boxes represents a layer, similar to Photoshop or any other program that uses layers. So the first thing I'm going to do is make another layer, because we're using 2 tiles. And then on this first tile, I'm going to open up the file, plug in a file node, and find my first tile. There it is, U1 V1. And I'm going to go back into the layer texture and plug in my second tile, which was U2 V1. There. And I'm going to open this in the hypershade so we can see things easier. Hypershade, select my Lambert and expand it. And there we go, those are our 2 tiles set up. Now, naming conventions are very important when you're setting this up, so it's almost, you have to be really, really careful when setting up the naming conventions, otherwise you'll be confused and you'll get lost and you'll have to start again. So what I like to do is just copy it straight from the file name, because that way you can't possibly mess it up. File underscore building diff, and then that's going to be place 2D, and then this one is going to be copied from here. File underscore building diff, and then change it to place 2D. And I'm going to name the layered texture as well. Layered texture building diffuse. And this is going to be the material building. And this is going to be the shading group building. Okay. Now it comes to setting up these. It's quite simple. You essentially just want to select all the layers and change the blend mode to add. So select each layer and change it to add one by one, like that. And now that will add them on top. So if we switch over to a render view, see how this looks there. Now immediately there's a lot of problems in that because the layer texture is set to add, it is adding the additional texture on top of the previous one, and it's messing with our alpha, it's messing with all the alignment of all the lines and everything, and we haven't actually offset the tiles yet. So to fix that, I'll just close the render. I'm going to go into the building diffuse. I'm going to select all the file nodes that I'm using. If you're using more than 2, then you'd obviously select all of those. And then go Window, General Editors, Attribute Spreadsheet. And you want to find the default color RGB, and you want to select those, all 3 values, and change it to 0. And then you would do that for all the files, but obviously because I'm just using 2, then I only have to do it for 2. And that's that setup. And then you want to go into the Place 2D files, select both of those, or however many you're using, and go back into the Attribute Spreadsheet. And then it comes down to the Translate Frame U and Translate Frame V. Now to set this up, you essentially do it 1 less than the file name. Mari will export a texture as U1V1. In that case, you want to set the translate U to 0 and the V to 0. Always do it as 1 less, and then everything will line up fine. So U1V1 is U0V0, and U2V1 is U1V0. And then you also want to make sure that for all your textures, the wrap U and wrap V is turned off, like that. And then if I render again, it's lined everything up, and that's using multiple tiles. And one way to check is just go into the UV texture editor, and there you can see it only ever shows the top tile because it can't do any of the layering in this window. There is a way to set it up, but I'm not entirely sure how. But seeing as it works at render time, then everything else is perfectly fine. I'm just going to switch over into shader mode, pressing 6, and you can actually see it in the viewport. Texture lines up fine, and we're using multiple tiles, and everything's perfect. Alright, hope this helps. Thank you for watching.